You gotta love cars. It's like an emotional roller coaster from the comfort of your house. Today we're going to go through the AAMC sample test, passage 1. I'm going to break down kind of the main idea, the high points from each passage, and how you can get each of these questions correct. Let's jump right in. The cool thing about the sample test is that everybody has access to it for free. So you can go on the AAMC's website and you can pull up this actual exam and try it out before I break it down. And then you can comment below and let me know how you did. So as we start this passage, the first thing I do with every single CARS passage is I go and I read the title. You don't have to. It just kind of breaks it up from the last passage for me. And so this title is called The Washington Diet. Okay, now I don't really know what that means. I don't know if they're talking about like Washington the state, or if they're referencing Washington, D.C., or if sometimes in the car section, because a lot of things are kind of political, they'll refer to something being Washington in reference to saying that this is something that is politicized or something that's controlled by the government. So you really don't know until you start reading, but regardless, you know that you're talking about some kind of diet that is specific to one of those 3 or 4 things I just mentioned. So, as I walk through this passage, I'm going to highlight the things that help me formulate my main idea, some of the arguments and the tone, and then I actually have that written below. So, let's jump right in. It says, in the second half of the 20th century, as the threat of communicable diseases receded, public medicine turned its attention to preventing and treating health problems that were not caused by germs. Okay, it seems like this is something that the author is okay with thus far. Just a little bit of background. So we went towards prevention. The death rates for chronic heart disease, in particular, seemed to be soaring after World War II. Some observers caution that the apparent increase might be the result of diagnostic advances. Okay, this right here, some observers. Do you notice how the author is kind of distancing him or herself from those observers by saying some people? You know, if you agree with that statement, you'll probably say many or most. But regardless, the author's definitely distancing him or herself, regardless of whether or not they believe. But they said some observers think that the apparent increase in heart disease could be a result of diagnostic advantages or advances, which had improved doctors' ability to detect heart ailments. However, this possibility failed to deter the press and advocacy groups like the American Heart Association from declaring the arrival of a frightening epidemic. Okay. So the author here in this first paragraph is kind of saying like, as we got better at medicine, we quit worrying about bacteria killing us and we started worrying about other things like food killing us. And even though some people thought that that was due to the fact that we have like calcium score tests and we can do TEEs and stuff like that to better see heart problems instead of just saying, oh, this person died of like a spirit overtaking their body. That really failed to deter some people like the AHA and other people from saying like, oh no, this is an epidemic. It's not just that we've always been this sick and we can just now tell it. Like we actually have a new problem. I don't know if the author agrees with that just yet, just from the framing of their words. One theory blamed the problem on the American diet and specifically on cholesterol. Okay, so now it looks like we shift towards this idea of diet. So we're saying that we have an increase in heart disease because of diet. And that kind of makes sense, right? The passage is titled The Washington Diet. Okay, of cholesterol, both the kind that you ingest when you eat animal products and the kind that your body produces when you eat saturated fat. After all, cholesterol is one component of the plaque that clogs arteries and causes heart attacks. But isolating the true causes of coronary disease proved elusive. So I want to pause real quickly because this right here is a little bit sciencey. And if you don't have a ton of experience with the car section on the MCAT, you're probably thinking like, oh, okay, like I need to remember that cholesterol can come from saturated fats, and you're kind of thinking like through the biochemical pathways. You're not going to get asked a question on that. When it comes to cars, They're not going to test you on anything that they're not already telling you or asking you to read between the lines on. Okay, so this is not a science section of the exam at all. So you don't have to worry about like memorizing those. And if you don't know them, that's fine. Just take those as freebies. In addition to diet, multiple factors were potential contributors to this coronary disease that is elusive, including genetics and personal habits such as smoking. So it seems like our author is saying like, okay, well, yeah, diet is one of the things, but there's a bunch of stuff going on here. And smoking is one that they called out by name, which is kind of interesting. Numerous studies on diet proved so inconclusive that in 1969, the National Institute of Health found no hard evidence, no, that's a really strong word, that what people ate had a significant impact on their heart disease. Okay, that's a really strong statement, because on the MCAT, you really don't get hard cut lines like this does work or this does not work very often. Or this is impossible, or this will never happen. You really don't get that stuff on the MCAT very often. So when you do, especially on cars, you want to kind of perk up and pay attention, because that's probably going to be, if the author is providing a really hard statement, it's probably going to help formulate how they view this problem. And remember, that's the whole idea of cars, is we just have to find a way to put ourselves in the author's shoes and to answer these questions. And that's most easily accomplished through a main idea. So that's where we left off. Nevertheless, in the 1970s, the Select Committee on Nutrition and Human Needs decided to fight the apparent epidemic by making nutritional recommendations. So even though there wasn't a problem, we're going to make some recommendations. Settling on the unproven, notice that the author's choice of language, right? This is not proven. I don't know why you're doing this, because it's not proven. Theory that cholesterol was behind heart disease, the committee issued its guideline in 1977. The guidelines urged people to reduce the fat that they consumed, principally by eating less meat and consuming fewer dairy products. The committee also advised raising carbohydrate intake and cutting one's intake of cholesterol by a quarter. Okay, so this is just the author saying, like, even though we didn't have a problem and there was no research to say that cholesterol was hurting us or causing heart disease, we said that we're going to eat less cholesterol, actively reduce it, and raise our carb intake. That was the nutritional guideline. Some of the country's leading researchers spoke out against the guidelines and against population-wide dietary recommendations in general. Edward Arons, an expert I want you to listen to how our MCAT author is like gassing up this Edward guy. He said, Edward is an expert in the chemistry of fatty acid substances at Rockefeller University, even like kind of drops his university. He characterized the guidelines as, quote, simplistic and a promoter of false hopes. Arons complained that the guidelines treated the population as a homogeneous group of lab rats while ignoring the wide variation in individual diet and blood chemistry. That's pretty scathing, right? And I just want you to think, like, whoever wrote this passage probably spent months researching it and probably another couple months writing this article. So everything that they chose to put in there is very carefully calculated. So if you're going to include a quote, it's going to support what you're arguing for. Okay, so unless our author drops what Edward is thinking and then immediately rebuts it, this is probably pretty close to in line with how our author feels. Because why would you bring in an expert in chemistry and quote an expert in chemistry if you disagreed with it? Because I'm probably going to side with the expert as the reader. The latest nutritional thinking has actually focused on carbohydrates as a potential cause of heart disease. Okay, so even though we just told them to eat more carbs, right? It says the latest stuff is focusing on carbs are the culprit. Several studies have concluded that easily digestible carbs, in particular, such as potatoes, white rice, bread from processed flour, and refined sugar, like my entire diet, make it difficult to burn fat and also increase inflammations that can cause heart attacks. This actually looks like something that the author agrees with. Do you notice how our author doesn't like immediately throw in something to kind of rebut it or rebuke it and say like this hasn't been proven, and actually the FDA proved it as false, like the author did with with cholesterol. So maybe our author agrees with that we shouldn't be eating a ton of carbs. Supporters of the guidelines have increasingly struggled to justify them. Okay, never mind. Supporters of the guidelines have increasingly struggled to justify them, sometimes resorting to political arguments. So saying that science doesn't back it up, so we're going to jump to politics. Without clear dietary guidelines, they claim, the food industry and other special interest groups could lobby political leaders and influence policy in unhealthy ways. So we have to have guidelines. Otherwise, people just like me will make problems just like I'm making. This argument makes sense only if you assume that the government's guidelines will be any healthier. Okay? So it works if your guidelines are healthier. Supporters also argue that the government's success in persuading people to stop smoking, which was equally paternalistic, justifies its efforts to change American eating habits. But the major scientific dissenters... Okay, so this is a really important word here, because this is almost a pretty good argument to me, but it's probably because I'm like vehemently against smoking. It's saying that supporters are saying, hey, not only like government can control how you eat, or the government can fund these ads against eating, because they did the same thing with smoking, and we saw increases in public health via that, kind of like paternalistic oversight. But our author gives us this word, but. That's a transition word. Major transition words on the MCAT really give away the author's tone and opinion. So anytime I see a but or therefore or something like that, I'm always going to try to see what is the purpose of it being there. It says the major scientific dissenters from government dietary policy are not especially concerned with government paternalism, though that is a legitimate issue. So the author's like, I don't really like you telling me what I can do, but that's really not my biggest problem with it. My biggest problem is they dissent because they find the government's evidence inadequate and its recommendations potentially harmful. This is the author's why. So the main idea we're going to be talking about, like, what our author is saying, and then we're also going to offer a little bit of like the supporting evidence of why the author believes that to be true. And that is going to be the why. The best thing that the U.S. government can do to promote health is to encourage people to develop their own individually tailored diet and exercise programs in consultation with healthcare professionals. Otherwise, public health medicine risks violating the central principle of medical ethics. First, do no harm. Okay. So that was a lot. We kind of jumped all over the place. We were talking about carbs. We were talking about like paternalism. We got Mr. Alfred or Edward or whatever dropping dimes. And then we get all the way back to the Hippocratic Oath of do no harm. And so how do you organize all that? What you should really say, what you should step back and ask yourself is, if I just had 15 seconds to explain to somebody what our author was trying to get across, what would I say? And this is it. This is my main idea. I think our author is saying that diet should be tailored to the individual by scientific professionals like healthcare providers, not controlled by unsupported and possibly unsafe government guidelines. Just like how the cholesterol decrease was possibly unsafe, it was definitely unsupported. This is what our author is mainly concerned with. You can throw in the argument of paternalism, but that's not... This paragraph right here showed us that like that wasn't the main issue. That is not the main idea. That's a big ticket argument. And we'll probably get asked a question or two about that, but that is not the main idea. They told us so. They said, I have a problem with this because your evidence is inadequate and its recommendations might harm me and the public. So that is main idea. The tone, I said very convinced. Our author, it wasn't necessarily like passionate, but it was pretty convinced. And then some of these arguments, I just went ahead and made a note of these. Dietary guidelines change and aren't evidence-based. The cholesterol was the first dietary guideline. It wasn't evidence-based. And then we started talking about how we should lower carbs because those are causing heart disease. And the author said that that was kind of hard to support. And then we have this idea that like paternalism is bad. Like we just generally don't want to be told what to do. We don't think that, or the author doesn't think that's the government's position. So keep that main idea in mind, or go ahead and write it down on a piece of paper beside you, and we're going to use that as we answer the questions here in just a second. Question number 1 says, the passage implies that some observers, and that's in quotations in the first paragraph, believe that what? I try to answer like every single question with my main idea if I possibly can. The one exception to that rule is if they tell me exactly where to go. Okay, if they tell me exactly where to go, usually it's some combination of an argument and the main idea, like a smaller argument and the main idea. And so I am going to jump to that first paragraph and see what they're actually referencing when they say some observers. Okay, here it is, some observers right here. It says some observers caution that the apparent increase might be the result of diagnostic advances. These are those people that were saying that I don't necessarily know that we actually have an increase in heart disease. We can just see what we actually already have a little bit better. So I'm kind of looking for an answer choice that's in line with that. A says there was no real increase in heart disease after World War II. I kind of like that answer choice. It seems to be in line with what we're looking for. But it's a little bit hard. See how it says there's no real increase? Like that's a little bit hard. Like I always like soft answer choices on the MCAT. And so I'll say maybe to A, but if there's an answer that's kind of in the same vein, but it's a little bit softer, I'm probably going to pick that one. So I'll say maybe to A. B says new diagnostic techniques were mistakenly identifying heart disease. I don't think he was saying that they were actually messing up. He was just saying that some people think that we're seeing more than we actually have, or we're seeing more that we have already had rather than we were misdiagnosing people. So maybe not to B. I don't really like B. C says the decrease in death rates after World War II had little to do with the increase in heart disease. That some observers were not talking about that at all. They would probably argue that death rates and heart disease kind of went hand in hand. This is making a logical leap. It's possible that if some observers thought that there was no real heart disease, then this increase in heart disease would not have much to do with, this increase in death rates would not have much to do with an increase in heart disease because there was no increase in heart disease. But that's a little bit of a logical leap, okay, because we don't really have this idea that those observers were upset about the increase in heart disease, or the increase in death rates. I'm sorry. It's kind of a tongue twister, but so I don't like C as much as A. So I'll say maybe not to C. And D says the increase in heart disease after World War II was somehow related to the decline in communicable diseases. Again, these people did not think that there was an increase in heart disease. And honestly, that's a good reason to rule out C as well. They didn't think that there was an increase in heart disease. So we can rule out C and D because of that. Correct answer would be A. Number 2 says the author suggests that concluding that diet is responsible for heart disease would be, okay, so this is a main idea question. Let's go back to our main idea. Diet should be tailored to the individual by scientific professionals, not controlled by unsupported and possibly unsafe government regulations. The author suggests that concluding that diet, solely diet, is responsible for heart disease would be A, mistaking cause for effect. The author would think that saying that heart disease would be responsible for your bad diet. That's what A is saying. That doesn't make sense. So maybe not A. B says mistaking correlation for causation. I think this one's actually kind of tempting because the science brain in me is like, oh yeah, anytime I see that, I'm going to click it. But we didn't talk about correlation here. We didn't talk about heart disease being correlated to anything. We didn't talk about any kind of correlation. And so I'll say maybe to B, but we didn't really talk about it. And a lot of times silence on the MCAT is pretty loud. If they're not going to explicitly say it, a lot of times you don't click it. So I'll say maybe to B, but I think that I like B because the scientist in me is attracted to it. So I'll say maybe to B, but maybe not. C says failing to consider a common cause. Our author made like a big argument that like the diet should be tailored. I mean, the main idea is saying that the diet should be tailored to the individual. Our purpose for tailoring it is because there's like a billion different causes. Or a bunch of different contributors. He said diet's one of them, genetics, social factors, exercise. Our author actually talked about that. So I don't think that the common cause is a good idea. So say maybe not to C. And then D says failing to consider additional causes. Okay, this is what I like, right? Because our main idea says we're going to tailor the diet. Why are we tailoring the diet? Because there's a bunch of different factors to take into account. Our author is going to say that if we're saying that just diet is responsible for heart disease, that X equals Y, we're failing to consider the other variables. So I say I like D a little bit better than B. B was just the scientist in me being like, I love that. Number next says Edward Arons' criticism. I think this is number 3. Yeah, Edward's, there's old Edward, is criticism as is presented in the passage essentially points to what? So we already kind of established that Edward's was used as a tool to support the main idea. So I can really rephrase this question as, which of these does the author view dietary guidelines? But if you forgot who Edward was, don't just like try to answer it blindly. Like you should go back and find who Edward is and what he said. He's right there. Don't reread the whole passage, though. That's where you get into trouble with your timing. Does our author think that diet is complex? Yeah. So I like answer choice 1. Does our author think that dietary guidelines are flexible? I don't know about flexible. I think that once you get one specific diet for one specific individual, it's pretty rigid. So I don't really like that. I don't like flexible that much. Does our author think that dietary guidelines involve diversity? Yeah, this is saying it's got to be individually tailored. Our main idea says it has to be individually tailored. That represents diversity. And it should be individually tailored by a scientific professional. Why? Because it's complex. Okay, do you see how I'm using the main idea to answer these questions by asking questions of my main idea? That's the way to do this. So I like 1 and 2. I like 1 and 3. The only one that says 1 and 3 is answer choice D. You can get into trouble. I know what a lot of you do. I know I've done it. But you can get into trouble by saying like, I like answer choice 1. Let me go rule out all the ones that don't have answer choice 1. And then you rule out C. And then you come back and you're like, I don't know about answer choice 2. I kind of like it. And then you go down, you rule all the ones. You can get into trouble by doing that. The best way to do this is read through all 3 or 4 Roman numerals. Pick the ones that you think answer the question appropriately, and then go to find the answer choice that agrees with that. Okay, number 4 says the author mentions easily digestible carbs in paragraph 5, most likely in order to what? Okay, so again, it told me what paragraph to go to, so I'm going to go there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Several studies have concluded that easily digestible carbs in particular, such as potatoes, blah, 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 John's diet, make it difficult to burn fat, and also increase inflammation that can cause heart attacks. But then he kind of went on to be like, but we also can't really support that. So, sucks. So what's the point of mentioning another dietary guideline? What does my main idea say? They're not great. They should be tailored by the actual doctors and stuff. So, why should they be tailored? Because they are unsupported and possibly unsafe. So, okay. Answer choice A says to imply that the 1977 guidelines may actually have harmed public health. Maybe, right? They were unsupported, they're unsafe, they're possibly harmful. So yeah, I mean, I think the author would probably agree with that. I'll say maybe to A. B says to suggest that nutritional thinking changes over time. That's kind of tempting. I've got it narrowed down between A and B right now because B doesn't sound bad. I just don't know if that was the purpose of talking about easily digestible carbs. I would actually say that our author is more of a subscriber to the idea that guidelines change over time, but that appropriate nutritional thinking should be established and not change. Like, it should change per individual. It should be tailored, but I don't know that he or she thinks that it should change over time. I like A a little bit more than B for that reason. C says, explain one cause of the current obesity crisis in the United States. That was not the purpose of this passage. The purpose of this passage was to talk about how dietary guidelines kind of suck and how they are made off of political decisions that lack scientific rigor and could harm us. So maybe not to C. Then D says, criticize the makeup of the dominant diet in the United States. We didn't talk about like which diet was most popular, even though it probably is a carb-heavy diet with the fast foods and stuff, but we didn't talk about that. So I don't really like D either. That was not the main idea of the passage. That wasn't the purpose of the passage. And so narrowing it down between A and B, I'm actually going to go see if I can see anything about these 1977 guidelines. So it looks like these 1977 guidelines were up here when we were talking about decreasing cholesterol and how we should raise carbohydrate intake. So if I'm going to decrease cholesterol and raise carbohydrate intake in 1977, the author's saying, hey, look, this has even changed. Now they're saying that we need to eat, drew my arrow too far. We need to eat more carbs. Some science says we need to eat more carbs. Or some science says that carbs are what are causing this inflammation and this heart disease. So in 1977, they said, hey, you just got to pound carbs, honey buns all day. And later, they're like, oh, no, that might kill you. And so the author is saying, like, hey, these guidelines in 77 that said pound oatmeal cream pies and cereal, that might have hurt some people. So that's why we need to be a little bit more careful, listen to the science and stuff like that, because you can hurt people. So I like A better than B for that reason. He's not saying that, hey, nutritional thinking changes over time. It's kind of okay. This is a little bit more of like a chill tone. Ooh, can't write very well. That's kind of a chill tone. This one is like eager. It's like, you're hurting people. We should stop it. We should probably be a little bit more proactive about this. Number 5 says, which of the following, if assumed to be true, would provide the best evidence to support the author's conclusion about how government should promote health? Okay, so I just look at this as which of these fits closest in line with the main idea. A says, making the presentation of nutritional information on food packaging mandatory was proposed by lobbyists. Okay, I mean, that's fine, but I don't think the author is necessarily saying that he wants more government mandates. So maybe not to A. B says, America's obesity rate was far lower when nutrition was largely parental responsibility. Well, yeah, that supports our argument, right? If that's true, that supports our argument, because our author was saying, like, this diet should not be in the hands of the government. It should not be regulated. This needs to be individual. So I like B. C says, most public health officials support some government involvement in nutritional policy. That would not support the author's conclusion, because that would say that if some people are for it, then maybe they're all right or something like that. So that's kind of like tangential. And then D says, government efforts to reduce smoking in the U.S. have been quite effective. Smoking and diet are different. I can see the common thread because they're both about health, but since we have an answer choice like B, that's pretty dang good. D is going to go in the trash because the MCAT can always say smoking and diet are different. Okay, so keep that in mind. If B wasn't there, if there were no good answer choices, you could argue for D, but B is there. You do have a good answer choice. So always go with what's safest. Always go with something that you know is true. Okay, number 6 says, which of the following criticisms of a proposed space shuttle flight, okay, where the heck are we going with this, is most likely that of the, quote, major scientific dissenters in paragraph 6 as the author presents their view. Cars does this, I don't know why, but they do this to where they'll like throw in some like wacky off the wall scenario. I mean, we're talking about diet and you're like, hey, what if Elon Musk wants you to go to the moon? And it's just the weirdest thing ever. But what they're trying to see is, can you figure out what the kind of like the sole push of these major scientific dissenters was, like why they had a problem with it, and apply it to a new scenario. That's all they're really trying to get at. So let's find them. Told us paragraph 6. Let's go to it and find it. I believe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it's this one. Major scientific dissent. I remember it was at the end. Oh, it was after this but statement. The major scientific dissenters are not especially... Okay, so their problem is not mainly with paternalism, even though they don't like it, but they dissent because they find the evidence inadequate and potentially harmful. Main idea, right? So this is one of those. Another one of those. I've actually seen like a couple today, where they're going to reference you to a paragraph, a specific location, but they want you to answer with the main idea. A says the composition of the shuttle crew violates equal rights legislation. Not really talking about equal rights anywhere in the passage, so I don't really like A. B says the shuttle flight is motivated mostly by political objectives. If you pick this answer, it's probably because you're highlighting. Okay, highlighting is a tool that can really bite you in the butt on cars because it allows you to memorize specific things on the page without internalizing what they're supposed to mean to you. And really the MCAT's mostly asking you to read between the lines. Okay. And so if you highlighted where they had a problem with it being paternalistic, you're probably going to pick B. So maybe not B. C says the shuttle assembly has serious design flaws. Would serious design flaws lack scientific excellence or rigor and be potentially harmful? Yeah. So I like C a whole lot. And then D says it's too expensive, and that's not related to the passage at all. So you have to find a common thread in these weird ones where they bring up an off-the-wall scenario. You have to find a common thread, and usually that common thread is somewhere within the main idea. And you'll notice like that's the very core of our main idea, is that we don't think diet should be unsupported or unsafe, and the government's making it so. Okay. And then the very last one says the author's arguments about government imply that he or she would be likely to oppose which of the following. Okay, so this is saying which of these does the author not like? Which of these does the author disagree with? A, legislation limiting the number of hours one can work per week. Okay, I don't really know what like the hours you can work per week has to do with anything, but I don't think our author would like the legislation limiting anything. B says a decrease in governmental subsidies to colleges and universities. Again, subsidies, we didn't really talk about them. We didn't even talk about education in general. But a decrease, our author seemed to be against paternalism, against government oversight or whatever. So maybe B is like something that our author would support. C says legislation loosening regulations on lobbyists. Okay, loosening. So this is less government again. And then D says a decrease in government oversight of school lunches. So this is less government again. So you see this is it's kind of convoluted, and you're playing this weird scenario again. But when you boil this question down, you see that this is just saying like our author was saying government needs to stay out of crap. Which of these agrees with that? A says we need less government. A says we need more government. B, C, and D say we need less government. So our author agrees with B, C, and D and disagrees with A. Rephrasing the question is very, very important. It can make some of these very difficult questions a little bit easier and a whole lot more manageable. That's all I've got for today. As always, make sure to give this button a like and subscribe to the channel so you can see us break down the rest of the exam. Thanks.